Hi guys, Mr. Brown here, and we're about ready to do a Pennium Lab. The Pennium Lab has to do with isotopes. Now, it's really difficult to see individual atoms, and so what we're going to do is we're going to use a substitute for that, or something that's going to stand for those atoms, and we're going to use pennies for this. But before we talk about that, let me remind you what isotopes are. Iso, the prefix iso means same. And so an isotope are atoms of the same element. That means they have the same number of protons, the same atomic number, but they have a different mass number. That means they have different numbers of neutrons here. And so if every atom only had one isotope, all the masses would be whole numbers. So let's turn this thing, let's look at this for a minute. Let's look at the periodic table. All right, on the periodic table here, when we look at this thing, chlorine, for example, if I look at the mass of chlorine, it says that it is 35.4527. Now, the smaller numbers don't mean so much, but there's actually only two isotopes of chlorine, chlorine 35 and chlorine 37. Now, if there was that mass that they put up there on the periodic table is actually an average of those two masses, 35 and 37. Well, you might say, but Mr. Brown, I can do math. If I average 35 and 37, that should be 36. Well, but this is 35.45. Well, what that tells me is that of the chlorine 35 and chlorine 37, there must be more chlorine 35 because the amount of chlorine 35 factors into this. The amount of chlorine 37 must be less because it's closer to 35.5. And if you look at that, all the elements that are up here on the periodic table, they all have different numbers with them. Now, some are close. For example, if you look at carbon up there, carbon has two isotopes, carbon 12 and carbon 14. Carbon 12, its mass is 12. It's exactly 12. Carbon 14 should be exactly 14. If I look at the mass up there for carbon, it's 12.011. That must mean there's not very much carbon 14 at all because it just raises the average a tiny bit. All right, hopefully you'll understand that when we're doing the lab. And so what we're going to do is we're going to figure out what the mass of the pennium would be here. So what we need to do is we're going to take 20 pennies. So I got a pile of 20 pennies here, and we are going to take the mass of each one of these one by one, and then we're going to write it down. 90. All right, the first thing we need to do is we need to get a total mass of all the pennies together. So here we have this zeroed, and I'm just going to pour these pennies out onto here, and the total mass is 56.61 grams. 56.61 grams. All right, so here I have my balance. I have it zeroed, and I have a pile of 20 pennies here that I want to get the mass of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys the year, and I'm going to give you the mass once I write it down. All right, so the first penny that I'm going to put down here is a 1980, gotta check here real quick, 1982. So I put that down there, and that 1982 pointed penny is 3.08 grams. The second penny I put down here is 1986, and that one says 2.49. Next penny, 1991. 1991 is 2.49. 2.50, 2.49, really close. And the next penny is 1962. That's an old one. That one is 3.04. Next penny, 1960, that's the year I was born, 3.08 grams. Next penny, 1985, 2.53. Next penny, 1984, 1984 is 2.52 grams. 1982, this one says 2.50. 2.51 grams, sorry. Or 2.50, we'll make it 2.50. Next penny, 1988, 2.54. And the next one, 1977, 3.08. Next penny is 1975, 3.09. $1971, 3.13. $1966, 3.11 grams. Next penny, 1979. And that one is 3.10 grams. Next penny, 1974. 3.13 grams. Whoops, 3.13. And next penny, 1990. Let's make sure we're zeroed here. 1990, 2.50. 1980, 3.09. Next penny, 1989, 2.51. We have a 1978, the year I graduated from high school, 3.09. And the last penny that we have here is a 1983 penny, and its mass is 2.50. I remember I was watching this. The Tonight Show used to be hosted by a guy named Johnny Carson. And the monologue he would do at the beginning, they would do 3 jokes, and then they would have their guests that would be on that night. It's kind of the same recipe that they do now for this with Jimmy Fallon. But anyway, Johnny Carson was popular, and this was back when I was just about out of college, just still in probably college at this time. And so anyway, he was doing a joke, and he was saying the penny is now worth more copper-wise than a penny. And suddenly, within a week, when he made that joke about this, he said pennies are actually, the copper in the penny is worth more than a penny. And he said it was like 2.5 pennies. Now, I want you to think about this. Some unscrupulous people, and this is illegal to do, went to the bank with $20 and say, hey, can I have $20 worth of pennies? And they would give them $20 of pennies, and then they could take it to some unscrupulous metal recycler, and he would give them what it was worth, and maybe $50. Well, if you can take $20 and turn it into $50 just by walking it down the street to the recycler, a lot of people did that, and suddenly there was not enough pennies out there, and they needed to mint or make more pennies. And so they were going to make the pennies differently than they did before. The way pennies were made before that time were by pennies were mostly copper. And then after this time, what they did is they made a pellet of zinc in the middle, and actually that zinc is just copper coated now. The newer pennies are copper coated zinc. Now, zinc doesn't make it for a very good penny, and I'll explain why. Back in World War II, there was a shortage of copper because they needed the copper to make brass for the bullets that they were using during World War II. And so it was really difficult to find pennies. For 1 year, they made iron pennies, pennies that were made out of iron. And that might sound like a good idea because iron's pretty cheap, but iron rusts, and people were walking around with change in their pocket, not like today. People had change in their pockets all the time, and pennies were much more useful than they are today. But their hands would get red from having the pennies, and their inside their pockets would turn red. They would get rusty, and after enough corrosion, you couldn't even tell that they were pennies anymore. So the next year they decided to make them out of zinc. And those are called white pennies because they would get crusty white outer covering as the zinc oxidized, and they didn't last very long either. They would last about a year, and then you couldn't even see Lincoln's face on them anymore. So if anybody has a zinc penny, it's probably been sealed up from the air so that it doesn't oxidize anymore. They didn't last very long. But copper is very durable, and so today, if you have zinc and it's coated with copper, it'll last a long time. But that year that they did that, the penny's mass changed because zinc is slightly less dense than the copper is. And so that little story should help you answer one of the questions that's on there. All right? Good luck.